The sun had barely crested the jagged horizon when Tyon emerged from the brush, his bare feet leaving faint prints in the dusty soil. The settlement lay ahead like a mirage of rough-hewn buildings and wind-battered wagons, a place he had long walked past, yet never truly entered. He was the son of the Apache king, yet here he was treated as though he belonged nowhere. Tyon's silence marked him as different. He had never spoken a word, not from lack of understanding, but because words never seemed adequate to capture the thoughts and visions that crowded his mind. In the eyes of others, silence was weakness, and weakness invited scorn. Tyon paused near the edge of the main road, his keen eyes taking in the morning bustle. Settlers hurried to their chores. Wagons rattled over uneven planks, and children darted about, their laughter sharp and careless. As he watched, a group of boys, rough-faced and sunburned, spotted him. Instantly they began their ritual mockery, jeering at his stillness. "Look, it's the mute kid," one called, pointing a crooked finger. Another mimicked him, moving his lips without sound, drawing cruel laughter from the rest. Tyon's jaw tightened, his hands clenching at his sides, but he said nothing. Words would do no good here. They had never bridged the gap between him and the judgmental eyes that studied him. Even the adults contributed to the alienation. The blacksmith shook his head and muttered to a neighbor as Tyon passed the forge, "King's boy? Might as well be a ghost. Can't talk, can't trade. Why bother?" The merchants avoided his gaze, withdrawing their wares when he lingered too long near the stalls. Tyon had learned long ago to move through the town like a shadow, seen but unseen, acknowledged only when necessary. He had mastered the art of invisibility in a world that refused to listen, yet Tyon was far from weak. Behind his quiet demeanor lay a mind that absorbed every detail: the flicker of a hawk's wings, the patterns of the river's currents, the faintest signs of an approaching storm. His father, the Apache king, recognized this, praising his son's attentiveness, his intelligence, and his courage. Within the encampment among his people, Tyon was respected and loved. But beyond the camp's protective circle, the wider world had yet to learn that silence could be strength. That morning, as Tyon lingered near the outskirts, a lone rider approached. The cowboy, mounted on a lean, tawny horse, wore a weather-beaten hat, pulled low over his eyes, a faded duster flapping with each step of the horse. He slowed as he neared Tyon, studying the boy with a curiosity that was different from the sneers and stares he had grown used to. Unlike the others, this man did not avert his gaze. He did not laugh. He did not call him names. There was something in the stranger's steady presence that made Tyon pause. The cowboy dismounted and stood a respectful distance away. His hand rested lightly on the reins, his posture unthreatening. Tyon tilted his head, measuring this new arrival. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he raised a hand in greeting, a gesture he had crafted over years of practice, simple yet clear. The cowboy's lips curved into a slight smile, and he lifted his hand in return. In that small exchange, Tyon felt a spark of something rare, acknowledgement without judgment. For the first time that morning, the air seemed lighter. Tyon could see the world through the lens of this stranger's acceptance, even if only for a moment. He realized that while townsfolk might never understand him, there were others who might, others who could see past the silence and recognize the person beneath it. His chest, so often tight with the weight of exclusion, felt a small, unfamiliar relief. Tyon stayed at the edge of the settlement longer that day, observing the movements of the people and animals, attuned to every sound, every shadow. And though he spoke no words, the connection he had made with the lone cowboy, the first thread of understanding in a world that had refused to hear him, was enough to stir hope. Perhaps, he thought, being silent did not mean being powerless. Perhaps in the quiet he could find a way to be seen. The next day, the sun had barely climbed above the jagged hills when Caleb returned. He rode slowly this time, as if the very act of approaching required caution. His horse's hooves kicked up small puffs of dust, and Tyon, hidden behind a cluster of mesquite trees, watched carefully. He had spent countless mornings observing strangers from afar, learning who could be trusted and who would bring only trouble. Caleb's demeanor was patient, not brash or confrontational like most settlers. That was different. Caleb dismounted near the same spot as before, leaving enough distance between himself and Tyon to honor the boy's comfort. He tipped his hat slightly, a gesture of respect, then sat cross-legged on the dry earth, patting his horse's neck in a quiet rhythm. Tyon's eyes narrowed. Was this man truly different? Or was he just another curiosity, here for a laugh before he disappeared like the others? To test him, Tyan raised a hand slightly, curling and uncurling his fingers in a subtle pattern he had developed to communicate with his father when words failed. It was a silent signal meaning, "Who are you?" Caleb watched intently, and then with a careful hand he mirrored the gesture. There was no mockery in his imitation, only understanding. Tyan blinked, a small spark of hope flickering within him. Caleb reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small scrap of paper and a piece of charcoal. He scratched a crude drawing of a sun and a mountain, then pointed to it and gestured toward Tyan, asking silently if he knew what it was. Tyan's lips quirked into the faintest hint of a smile. He responded by drawing a line of his own, depicting the path he took through the desert each morning. Their first true exchange of ideas occurred without words, and yet it felt like a conversation that could span hours. Over the next few days, Caleb returned regularly, each time staying a little longer. He learned to recognize the signs Tyan used: small finger movements, slight tilts of the head, a series of hand waves. Tyan, in turn, observed Caleb's gestures with intense scrutiny, noting the subtle cues in his posture, the way his hands moved when he wanted to point, or when he tried to ask a question. Slowly, a language began to form between them, a dance of motion and understanding that required patience, focus, and trust. Caleb also began to show Tyan skills he had picked up from years on the trails: how to spot fresh tracks in the sand, how to read the wind for approaching storms, and how to handle a rope or tool with precision. Tyan absorbed it all eagerly, not just because he wanted to learn, but because this man treated him as a capable equal, not a mute child to be dismissed. For the first time, Tyan felt seen. It was during one quiet moment as the sun dipped low and painted the desert in shades of gold and blood red that Tyan realized something profound. The world he had always perceived as hostile could be different. Not everyone would mock him. Not everyone would see silence as a weakness. In Caleb's presence, silence became a bridge, not a wall. And the cowboy, too, seemed to understand that their bond required patience. That strength did not always announce itself in words, but sometimes in the quiet determination to be understood. That evening, Caleb left as silently as he had come, giving Tyan space, but not before making a simple gesture. He pointed to his heart, then to Tyan, then tipped his hat in a gentle promise of return. Tyan watched the figure fade into the horizon, a strange mix of hope and caution swirling within him. He realized that for the first time he had found someone willing to see him, not the silence, not the label, but him. And in that recognition, Tyan discovered a flicker of courage he had never known before. The settlement remained as hostile as ever, the town's whispers sharp as a rattlesnake's strike. Yet in the shadow of Caleb's quiet presence, Tyan felt ready. He could face the stares, the mockery, even the scorn, because now he knew he was not alone. And sometimes in the Wild West that was more powerful than any words spoken aloud. The following morning, Tyan awoke with the sun spilling golden light across the desert sands. The memory of Caleb's visit lingered in his mind like a warm ember, a reminder that connection could exist even in a world so quick to judge. Today, Tyan decided he would not simply watch from the shadows. He would show Caleb something of the skill and cunning that had long gone unnoticed. Caleb arrived as promised, riding slowly along the sandy path, his horse kicking up little clouds of dust. He dismounted at the usual spot, tipping his hat in greeting, his eyes scanning the horizon for Tyan. The boy stepped from behind a cluster of scrubby bushes, carrying a bundle of arrows he had crafted himself. Every movement was precise, deliberate, a reflection of years spent observing, learning, and mastering the land. Without a word, Tyan began a silent demonstration. He laid the arrows on the ground in a series of patterns illustrating a tracking method he had devised to anticipate the movement of animals across the desert. Caleb watched intently, nodding occasionally, his eyes bright with understanding. Tyan then gestured for Caleb to follow him. Together they moved through the sand and sagebrush, Tyan pointing, guiding, and signaling, showing how to detect footprints invisible to the untrained eye, and how to interpret the direction of the wind for signs of life or danger. At one point, Tyan crouched beside a set of faint tracks in the sand, his fingers tracing the shapes carefully. He tapped the ground, then gestured to Caleb, mimicking the small movements of a rabbit skittering past. Caleb's brow furrowed in concentration, Then a slow smile spread across his face. He mimicked the gestures, and for a moment, they became two minds connected through motion, reading the desert as one. It was more than just skill. Tyan's intelligence shone in his ability to anticipate, to plan, and to adapt. He led Caleb to a shallow creek bed, where he demonstrated how to gather water from hidden pockets, how to read the river rocks for signs of nearby fish, and how to move silently so as not to disturb the natural balance of the land. Caleb, impressed, realized that Tyan's silence was not a limitation. It was a strength. It had honed his senses, sharpened his mind, and taught him patience and observation in a way that many speaking men and women would never know. As they paused to rest beneath the shade of a lone mesquite tree, Tyan produced a small clay bowl he had shaped himself. He gestured for Caleb to taste the water he had collected, and then mimicked the actions of catching small desert fish with nimble hands. Caleb laughed quietly, a soft, unassuming sound that carried easily across the open land. For Tyan, the laughter was not mockery. It was acknowledgement. It was the first time someone had truly seen him, not as the mute son of a king, but as a capable, clever young man. By midday, they had covered several miles of desert, and Caleb was exhausted but exhilarated. Tyan, as always, seemed tireless, moving with the fluid grace of someone perfectly in tune with the land. As the sun climbed higher, Tyan paused and pointed to the distant settlement, signaling that it was time to return. Caleb nodded, understanding the silent instruction. Back near the edge of town, Tyan finally allowed himself a small, private smile. Today he had shown Caleb not just his skills, but the sharpness of his mind, the strength in his body, and the quiet courage that had long gone unrecognized. In turn, Caleb had acknowledged him, not with words but with patience, with respect, and with genuine interest. For Tyan, that was enough. He had planted a seed of understanding in a world that had refused to see him, and he felt a flicker of hope for the first time in years. Perhaps with Caleb by his side, the whispers of the town and the pointed fingers of the children would carry less weight. Perhaps silence, he realized, was not a wall but a language, and those willing to learn it might find themselves seeing more than they ever had before. As they parted ways that evening, Caleb gestured toward Tyan with a hand to his chest and a tip of his hat, a silent promise of return. Tyan nodded in response, his heart steady and sure. The first true bridge between his world and the one beyond the settlement had been built, not with words but with trust, skill, and the quiet power of being understood. The settlement had not changed overnight. The narrow streets still smelled of dust and livestock, and the clamor of merchants and laborers filled the air. But Tyan walked among the people with a new confidence, bolstered by the bond he had begun to form with Caleb. Still, the whispers followed him like shadows. Mothers pulled their children closer when he passed. Shopkeepers refused to make eye contact. Even some of the town's older men, hardened by years of frontier life, shook their heads as if he were a ghost walking among the living. Caleb rode into town that morning, as he had promised, and dismounted near the central square. His eyes quickly found Tyan, standing a few paces away, arms crossed, observing the townsfolk. With a slow, deliberate gesture, Caleb beckoned him over, tilting his head in encouragement. Tyan moved forward, cautious but determined. Today he would not remain invisible. The first challenge arrived quickly. A group of children, older and bolder than those who had mocked him before, began shouting, throwing stones, and mocking Tyan's silence. "Can't talk, can't fight, can't do anything," On yelled, a cruel grin splitting his freckled face. Tyan's jaw tightened, and for a moment he considered retreating. But Caleb stepped beside him, placing a firm hand on Tyan's shoulder. He shook his head, a silent command to stand strong. Tyan lifted his hand slowly, fingers moving in a series of deliberate gestures. He mimicked the flight of a hawk overhead, then traced a circle in the dust to indicate the bandits who sometimes roamed the hills outside town, the same way his father had taught him to track dangers in the desert. Caleb watched, nodding as he understood the story Tyan was telling without words. He pointed to one of the children, then to Tyan, indicating that he wanted to show them what the boy could do. Carefully, Caleb took a stick and drew in the dirt, illustrating a scene of the desert, the hidden trails, and the clever traps Tyan could set. The children's laughter faltered as they watched the clarity of Tyan's movements, the intelligence behind every sign. Caleb gestured toward the creek beyond town, then mimicked Tyan's silent tracking gestures, demonstrating that Tyan's skills were real, practical, and far beyond their understanding. Even the adults paused, curious despite themselves. The blacksmith leaned on his bench, squinting at Tyan with a mixture of disbelief and grudging admiration. The merchants, too, murmured among themselves, seeing for the first time that the boy's silence did not mean incompetence. It was a different kind of mastery, subtle yet undeniable. Encouraged, Tyan continued, demonstrating the intricate ways he could move silently through the brush, how he could find fresh water sources hidden from common sight, and how he could read animal tracks with near-perfect accuracy. Each gesture, each sign conveyed knowledge and precision that demanded respect. The children, once so quick to mock, now whispered in awe, exchanging astonished glances. By midday, the air had shifted. Though prejudice did not vanish, curiosity began to replace fear. Caleb had become the bridge, translating Tyan's gestures, allowing the town to see the value hidden in the boy's silence. And Tyan, for his part, realized something profound. He could influence this world even without words. Actions, skill, and quiet confidence spoke louder than the shallow insults of those who had once scorned him. As the sun began to dip low, painting the buildings in hues of orange and gold, Caleb offered a small smile and gestured toward the horizon, signaling the end of their demonstration. Tyan returned the gesture, a silent acknowledgement of their shared victory. Though the town still held whispers and doubts, Tyan felt a growing sense of belonging. He was no longer merely the mute son of the Apache king. He was a force to be reckoned with, seen and understood by at least one ally, and slowly beginning to be recognized by others. The day ended with Tyan standing at the edge of town, watching the settlers return to their homes, the wind stirring the dust around his boots. Caleb rode beside him, eyes forward, a quiet presence that reassured the boy. In that moment, Tyan knew that the path ahead would not be easy, but for the first time he felt ready. With trust, patience, and his silent strength, he could face the prejudice of the world, and perhaps one day change it. The morning sun cast a pale glow over the settlement, illuminating the dusty streets and the wooden buildings that leaned against the wind. Tyan awoke with a restless energy, a subtle tension in the air that even the whispering wind seemed to echo. Caleb was already on the outskirts, waiting patiently, his horse pawing the ground. Today, Tyan sensed, would be unlike any other. The quiet of the morning shattered with the distant rumble of hooves and the sharp clatter of metal. Bandits, well-armed and desperate, charged toward the settlement from the hills, their shadows stretching long in the rising sun. Panic spread immediately. Merchants dropped crates, children screamed, and townsfolk scattered for cover. The elders shouted for defenders, but fear froze most of them in place. Tyan didn't hesitate. Years of observing, tracking, and understanding both land and people had prepared him for moments like this. He glanced at Caleb, whose eyes met his with a silent question, an acknowledgement of trust. Without speaking, Tyan raised his hands, moving his fingers and arms in a precise series of gestures, a silent code Caleb had begun to understand. Each sign outlined a plan, which paths to block, where to herd the attackers, and which areas of the town required immediate protection. Caleb nodded, translating Tyan's signs to the few settlers brave enough to follow. "Over here! Block the north path!"
"Move quietly!"
he shouted, though his voice was drowned out by the chaos. Tyan moved like a shadow, darting from alley to alley, signaling with hands and eyes, directing people with exact precision. His silent commands carried the authority of someone who understood the land, the town, and the human instinct to survive. A bandit tried to force his way into the blacksmith's shop, swinging a heavy club. Tyan, with a swift motion, signaled Caleb to intercept. In a blur of motion, Caleb blocked the man's path and, with the silent guidance of Tyan's hands, managed to push him back toward the main street, where other townsfolk were beginning to rally. Tyan's tactics were not brute force. They were clever, strategic, and methodical. Each move turned the tide, each silent command saving someone from harm. Children and women who had first cowered now began to participate, following Caleb's translations of Tyan's signs. Tyan led them to safety, guiding them through narrow passages and hidden exits, all while keeping an eye on the attackers. His silence, once seen as a weakness, became a tool. No words to shout, no cries to betray his position. He was everywhere and nowhere, orchestrating a defense that the bandits could not anticipate. By mid-morning, the attackers were disoriented, confused by the coordinated efforts of a settlement they had assumed would crumble. Tyon spotted the leader, a towering man with a cruel sneer attempting to regroup his men for a final push. With a swift, precise motion, Tyon indicated to Caleb the weak point in the bandits' formation. Caleb signaled the settlers, who surged with newfound courage, driving the attackers back into the hills. When the dust settled, the town was intact, and the bandits had fled. Breathless and dirt-streaked, Caleb approached Tyon, clapping him gently on the shoulder. The settlers gathered slowly, murmuring among themselves, eyes wide with a mixture of awe and disbelief. The boy they had mocked, the mute son of the Apache king, had saved them all, not through speech, but through intelligence, courage, and silent authority. The blacksmith, usually quick with criticism, stepped forward, gripping Tyon's hand in a rare display of respect. "Kid, you've got guts," he said, voice low and reverent. Merchants nodded, children stared with admiration, and even some of the older men gave grudging nods of approval. Caleb smiled, tipping his hat to Tyon, who returned a subtle gesture, a small bow, barely perceptible but full of pride. For Tyon, the day marked a turning point. The town's scorn had given way to awe, their suspicion replaced with respect. And in the quiet exchanges he shared with Caleb, he realized something profound. Words were not always necessary to be understood. Actions, courage, and trust could speak louder than any speech. For the first time, Tyon felt that he had a place in this world, not just as the king's son, but as someone who could protect, guide, and inspire. As the sun set, painting the horizon in fiery hues, Tyon stood beside Caleb, looking out over the settlement. The town was still wary, still cautious, but they had glimpsed his strength. And in that glimmer of recognition, Tyon knew that this was only the beginning. The settlement had never been quieter, yet the calm carried a strange electricity. Word of the bandit attack and the boy who had orchestrated the defense had spread like wildfire. Whispers filled every corner of the town. "The mute boy. He's clever. Did you see him? He saved the North Path." Tyon moved through the streets with a new awareness. People no longer stared only to sneer. Now many watched with curiosity, some with grudging respect. The balance had begun to shift, though prejudice still lingered like a shadow. Caleb arrived that morning, dismounting his horse near the familiar mesquite tree. Tyon greeted him with a subtle gesture, a lift of the hand, fingers curling into the signal they had developed. Caleb returned it with a warm smile, then gestured for Tyon to follow him toward the edge of town. Today they had work to do, not just for survival, but for understanding. Tyon's plan was simple. He would continue to demonstrate his skills and intelligence, not through words, but through action. He wanted the town to see that his silence was not a flaw but a tool. First, he led Caleb and a small group of interested townsfolk to the creek outside the settlement. Using gestures, he showed how to find fresh water hidden beneath the sand, then indicated how to construct a makeshift filtration system. The settlers watched, impressed by the precision and practicality of his methods. Next, Tyon demonstrated tracking. He guided them through a maze of desert scrub and rocky outcrops, pointing out faint animal tracks, the subtle bend of grass, and the scattered feathers of birds that indicated danger or prey. Caleb translated the gestures, explaining what each signal meant. The townsfolk followed, marveling at the boy's observational skills. Even the blacksmith, usually quick to grumble, nodded appreciatively. "I'd never have noticed half of that," he admitted, wiping sweat from his brow. As the sun climbed, Tyon turned to the next lesson: strategy. He moved quickly yet gracefully, laying out a series of signals to indicate positions for defense in case of another attack. Using rocks, sticks, and small mounds of sand, he mapped out the town's streets and weak points. Caleb interpreted, pointing to strategic locations while Tyon mimicked the movements of hypothetical intruders. The settlers were captivated, realizing the depth of Tyon's mind and the way he could anticipate threats without hesitation or fear. By midday, a few children gathered nearby. Hesitant at first, then increasingly curious, Tyon invited them to mimic his gestures, showing them how to read tracks, identify hidden dangers, and navigate the terrain safely. The children's laughter, once a source of mockery, became a chorus of engagement and learning. Tyon's silence had become a language of empowerment, and those willing to listen discovered a new form of understanding. Even the town's adults began to soften. The general store owner, who had once avoided Tayan, now lingered nearby, quietly observing. A few women nodded as they passed, acknowledging the boy's skill without saying a word. The air was thick with a sense of realization. Tayan's muteness was not a limitation, it was a form of clarity, a lens through which he perceived the world more acutely than most. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the desert floor, Tayan and Caleb returned to the settlement. The town, once so quick to reject him, now watched with a mixture of respect and cautious admiration. Tayan knew the journey was far from over. Prejudice ran deep and some would never fully understand him, but for the first time, he felt a real sense of inclusion, a tentative bridge between his world and theirs. Caleb patted his shoulder gently, a silent affirmation of pride. Tayan returned the gesture carrying more weight than any words could convey. In that moment, standing at the edge of the settlement with dust swirling at his boots, Tayan realized that acceptance was not given. It was earned through courage, patience, and the quiet power of being understood. The settlement would never be the same, and neither would he. Tayan had begun to reshape how they saw him, and perhaps in time how they saw themselves. And with Caleb by his side, he felt ready for whatever challenges the Wild West could throw their way. The morning sun beat down relentlessly on the settlement, glinting off tin roofs and the polished barrels of rifles leaned against shop walls. Tayan moved quietly along the edge of town, his eyes scanning for signs of trouble. Though many of the townsfolk had begun to respect him after the bandit attack, a lingering undercurrent of skepticism remained. Not everyone was ready to see him as capable. Some whispered that his previous heroics had been luck, not skill. Caleb rode in at his usual hour, his horse kicking up clouds of dust. Tayan greeted him with the familiar hand gesture, and Caleb responded with a subtle nod, signaling that today they would face not just the desert, but the prejudice of the town itself. A few townsfolk had dared to challenge Tayan's growing reputation, suggesting that a boy who could not speak could never truly lead, could never protect, and certainly could not be trusted. Today, Caleb and Tayan would prove them wrong. The first confrontation came as they approached the main square. A group of skeptical settlers, led by a stern-faced farmer, stepped forward. "You saved the town once," the farmer said, his voice edged with doubt. "But how do we know it won't happen again?" "You're silent. How can we follow someone who can't speak?" Tayan's lips did not move, but his eyes locked with the man's, steady and unflinching. He raised a hand, curling his fingers in a motion Caleb had come to understand, a signal for strategy. Caleb interpreted aloud, his voice calm but firm. "He knows where danger comes from before it reaches us. Watch." Tayan led the group to the outskirts of the settlement, pointing out subtle signs most of the town had ignored: the faint tracks of a coyote pack, a broken branch signaling recent passage, the angled feathers of a hawk circling overhead. Caleb translated each gesture, showing how these details could predict movements across the landscape. The settlers followed, at first hesitantly, then with growing interest as Tayan demonstrated not just observation, but foresight. Next came a test of skill. Tayan moved swiftly to a series of old, unused stock pens, signaling to Caleb to prepare a demonstration. Using nothing but his hands, he illustrated how to herd animals safely, redirecting them with calculated motions and a deep understanding of their behavior. Caleb helped execute the plan, guiding the townsfolk through Tayan's silent instructions. The skeptics watched as the animals moved precisely where Tayan intended, responding to his gestures as if guided by some unseen force. Murmurs of astonishment rippled through the crowd. Even more impressive was Tayan's ability to anticipate human movement. He indicated how the settlers could position themselves defensively should bandits, or worse, return. Each gesture carried meaning, each movement calculated to maximize safety and efficiency. Caleb, interpreting, allowed the townsfolk to witness the depth of Tayan's intelligence firsthand. No words were needed. Actions spoke clearly and decisively. By the end of the morning, the skeptics could no longer deny what they had seen. Tayan's silent authority had won over even the most doubtful. The stern-faced farmer, arms crossed at first, now nodded, his jaw set in reluctant respect. "Kid, maybe you do know what you're doing," he admitted, the words heavy with begrudging admiration. Children who had previously mocked Tyan now watched in awe, mimicking his hand gestures and learning to read the landscape as he did. Tyan, standing beside Caleb, allowed himself the smallest smile, a fleeting acknowledgement of progress. He had not spoken a word, yet his intelligence, courage, and skill had silenced the doubters. The town's perception was shifting, slowly but irrevocably, and he was at the center of that change. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the dusty streets, Caleb patted Tyan's shoulder in silent congratulations. Tyan returned the gesture, his heart steady. Today had been a victory not just for survival, but for understanding. Words were unnecessary. Actions, patience, and quiet brilliance had proven more powerful than any speech could be. Tyan realized something profound as he looked at the faces of the settlers. Respect, once earned, could change hearts. And with Caleb by his side, guiding and translating when needed, there was no limit to what they could accomplish together in the Wild West. The settlement had begun to see him not as the mute son of a king, but as a leader in his own right, a silent hero whose influence was just beginning. The settlement had grown quieter in the mornings, not from fear, but from anticipation. People waited to see what the silent boy, Tyan, the son of the Apache king, would do next. His influence was subtle yet undeniable. Children mimicked his hand gestures. Merchants began to heed his quiet advice about water sources and tracking the herds, and even the blacksmith would sometimes nod in agreement when Tyan pointed out an angle in the wind that might affect the forge fires. Caleb arrived at the usual hour, guiding his horse beside Tyan. "Ready?" he asked, his voice low, though it carried a tone of camaraderie rather than command. Tyan lifted his hand in a small curl, a gesture they had developed for yes, and together they set off toward the outskirts of town. Today the goal was not defense or survival, it was understanding, a chance for Tyan to show the town the value of trust and observation. The first demonstration came in the open fields beyond the settlement. Tyan guided Caleb and a group of settlers, including a few reluctant adults and some curious children along the patterns of the land. He pointed to footprints, to bent stalks of grass, to small clumps of disturbed soil. Each subtle sign told a story, where animals had grazed, which paths bandits might take, or where water could be found during dry spells. Caleb translated, speaking clearly but briefly while Tyan moved through the demonstration, his gestures precise and deliberate. The settlers began to follow more attentively. Some adults whispered to one another, amazed at the boy's acute perception. The children, wide-eyed, mimicked his hand movements, learning to read the landscape in ways they had never imagined. Tyan's silence had become a language, and the town's inhabitants were learning to speak it slowly but surely. Later, Tyan led the group to the remains of an old corral. He gestured toward a series of boards and fences, signaling Caleb to demonstrate how the structure could be reinforced to contain livestock more efficiently. Tyan's motions were fluid, almost like a dance, and Caleb followed without hesitation, allowing the settlers to see the logic behind each silent instruction. The adults began to nod in approval, murmuring to one another about the boy's ingenuity and skill. As they worked, Caleb encouraged dialogue between Tyan and the townsfolk, helping them interpret not just gestures but the reasoning behind them. "He sees things differently," Caleb explained to a skeptical merchant, "but every move he makes has a purpose. Watch closely. There's a method here." Tyan, observing quietly, occasionally corrected Caleb with a subtle hand gesture or a tilt of the head, refining the message. By mid-afternoon, even the most doubtful settlers had begun to appreciate that Tyan's silence was not emptiness but focus. The day ended with a small challenge. Caleb suggested they test what they had learned by leading a mock search and rescue exercise with the children, using the lessons Tyan had demonstrated. Tyan gestured instructions with deliberate clarity, guiding the kids to locate a hidden lost animal toy in the scrub. Laughter and excitement filled the air as the children worked together, following his silent cues. The adults watched, impressed at how quickly the children adapted, learning not just skills but patience, observation, and trust. By sunset, the entire group returned to the settlement weary but satisfied. The air was thick with newfound respect for the boy who had once been an outcast. Even those who had doubted him at first now approached quietly, asking questions or seeking guidance on tracking, water sources, or ways to better manage their animals. Tyan responded with gestures and a small nod of acknowledgement, his eyes bright with quiet satisfaction. Caleb patted his shoulder gently. "You've done more than they expected," he said softly. Tyan returned a subtle hand curl, a gesture for thank you, though words were never necessary between them. In that moment, Tyan understood something profound. Connection did not always require speech. Through patience, demonstration, and mutual trust, he had begun to bridge the gap between his world and the settler's world. As they walked back toward the town, Tyan glanced at the horizon. He could see that slowly, day by day, the people were learning to see him, not as a mute boy, but as a teacher, a guide, and a leader. And with Caleb by his side, there was no limit to what they could accomplish together in the harsh, unforgiving Wild West. The wind carried an uneasy tension through the settlement that morning. Word had spread of a new threat. A group of outlaws, larger and more ruthless than the bandits who had attacked before, were approaching from the north. Rumors stirred fear among the townsfolk, some of whom had begun to rely on Tyan's guidance. Now their faith would be tested. Tyan stood at the edge of town, the desert stretching before him in gold and ochre. Caleb rode beside him, scanning the horizon. Tyan's eyes narrowed, taking in every subtle sign. A trail of dust kicked up by the outlaws' horses, the faint glint of metal in the sunlight, the uneven rhythm of hooves on hard-packed soil. Each observation built a silent map in his mind, a strategy ready to unfold. The townsfolk, gathering nervously in the square, looked to Caleb for direction. He pointed to Tyan, then made a sweeping gesture toward the hills and paths leading to town. "Watch and follow his lead," he said firmly. Though Caleb spoke, the settlers looked first at Tyan, understanding that this silent boy held the key to their survival. Tyan raised his hands, curling and flicking fingers in a rapid sequence of signals, conveying positions for the defenders, escape routes, and ambush points. Caleb interpreted, speaking each instruction with clarity and authority. The settlers moved quickly, their initial hesitation replaced with growing confidence as Tyan's planning unfolded with precision. The first encounter came sooner than expected. A group of outlaws broke from cover, charging down the ridge toward the town's northern edge. Tyan, from a concealed position, gestured swiftly to Caleb, who relayed the silent commands to the settlers. People moved with purpose, blocking narrow paths and funneling the outlaws into zones carefully chosen by Tyan's keen observation. Amid the chaos, Tyan demonstrated the depth of his intelligence. He signaled Caleb to lead a small group to flank the attackers from the side, anticipating the outlaws' reactions. Caleb nodded, understanding immediately, and executed the maneuver flawlessly. Tyan then indicated the use of the terrain itself, loose stones, brush, and hidden gullies to slow the outlaws' advance. Every gesture counted, every motion carefully considered. The battle unfolded like a silent symphony. Tyan directed, Caleb translated, and the settlers executed with increasing skill. Even the children, under careful supervision, contributed, following Tyan's earlier lessons on movement and observation. The outlaws, disoriented by the coordinated defense, faltered. One by one, they were forced to retreat, their confidence shattered by a group led by a mute boy and a cowboy who understood him. When the last of the outlaws vanished beyond the hills, the settlement erupted in awe and relief. Townsfolk who had doubted Tyan's abilities now approached him with reverence, nodding and murmuring their gratitude. The children crowded around, imitating his gestures with wide-eyed excitement, eager to learn more. Even the oldest men, who had initially scoffed at the idea of following a silent leader, now treated him with respect bordering on admiration. Caleb rode to Tyan's side, his voice quiet but warm. "You did it. You saved them all." Tyan responded with a slight curl of his fingers, the gesture for acknowledgement, pride, and humility all rolled into one. No words were necessary. The settlement had witnessed not just bravery but leadership, intelligence, and the quiet power of understanding. That evening, as the sun dipped below the jagged horizon, painting the town in shades of fire and gold, Tyan and Caleb walked through the streets. Settlers no longer avoided him. They sought his guidance, asked questions, and followed his silent instruction. The boy who had once been mocked and dismissed was now the town's unspoken hero, the bridge between fear and trust, between isolation and community. Tyan understood something profound as he looked across the settlement. Words could convey commands, promises, or threats, but actions, skill, intelligence, courage could change hearts and shape destinies. And with Caleb by his side, Tyan had proven that silence could speak louder than any shout, that understanding could be forged without a single word, and that even a boy thought powerless could become the backbone of an entire town. The Wild West, harsh and unforgiving, had met its silent hero, and he had not just survived. He had triumphed. The settlement awoke to a morning unlike any other. The wind carried no threat, only a calm that felt earned, as if the desert itself acknowledged the courage that had been displayed. Tyan walked through the streets with a measured step, his eyes calm and observant. For the first time, he was not avoided, not whispered about, not mocked. The town had accepted him, not just as the son of the Apache king, but as a leader, a protector, and a bridge between worlds. Children ran past, waving eagerly, mimicking the gestures Tyan had taught them. Merchants and townsfolk approached respectfully, asking questions about tracking, water, and safety. Even those who had once doubted him now nodded, their admiration quiet but unmistakable. The boy who had been silent and scorned had transformed the town's perception through intelligence, courage, and patient teaching. Caleb rode beside Tyan, his horse steady and calm. The cowboy had been more than a friend. He had been translator, confidant, and partner in every challenge. Caleb tipped his hat to the settlers, acknowledging their growing trust, then looked at Tyan with a quiet smile. The bond between them had become unspoken yet undeniable, rooted in respect, loyalty, and shared triumphs. The final test of acceptance came that afternoon. A caravan of traders approached from the east, unfamiliar and cautious. As they entered the town, fear and uncertainty flickered in their eyes. They had heard whispers of the boy who could not speak and wondered if the settlement was safe. Tyan stepped forward, walking alongside Caleb, and gestured to the surrounding terrain, pointing out water sources, safe routes, and the natural defenses of the town. Caleb interpreted, though the gestures themselves spoke with clarity. The traders watched, initially wary, then with growing astonishment. They saw what the townsfolk had already begun to understand. Tyan's silence was not a weakness, it was focus, intelligence, and skill manifested in movement. The boy led them confidently to the main square, demonstrating tracking methods and safe navigation through the surrounding hills. By the time they settled into the town's inn, the traders' skepticism had been replaced with trust. They would not only conduct business here, but they would speak of this town and its remarkable silent guide. As the sun set, Tyan stood on the ridge overlooking the settlement, the warm glow of evening painting buildings and wagons in shades of amber and gold. Caleb joined him silently, standing just behind, a reassuring presence. The town lay peaceful below, children playing, adults conversing, the marketplace alive with energy and purpose. It was a far cry from the isolation and scorn Tyan had once known. For the first time, Tyan allowed himself a small smile. His journey had been one of patience, courage, and quiet persistence. Through skill, intelligence, and the guidance of Caleb, he had earned his place in a world that had once rejected him. The settlement now looked to him not as the mute son of a king, but as a protector and teacher, a hero whose silence spoke louder than any words. Caleb placed a firm hand on Tyan's shoulder. "You've done more than anyone thought possible," he said softly. "They see you now. They trust you. And they've learned something too, how to see the world in a way they never knew." Tyan nodded, a subtle curl of the fingers conveying acknowledgement, gratitude, and the quiet pride of accomplishment. As night fell, stars blanketing the desert sky, Tyan realized that his journey had changed more than the town. It had changed him. Silence, he understood, was not absence but presence. It was not weakness but strength. And with Caleb by his side, he felt ready for whatever challenges might come, certain that respect, trust, and understanding could bridge even the widest divides. The settlement, once a place of mockery and exclusion, had become a community bound by new understanding, and at its heart stood Tyan, the silent hero of the Wild West, a boy who spoke without words and led with courage, intelligence, and an unwavering spirit. In the quiet of the desert night, with the stars watching above, Tyan knew he had finally found his place, both in the town and in the vast untamed world beyond.